Welcome to this evening's online event entitled Reporting on Palestine in Conversation with Palestinian Journalists, facilitated by the Palestinian Return Center. This evening's panel discussion will be hearing from Palestinian journalists in Palestine and also around the world discussing Palestine's major headlines in 2024 thus far, the headlines that didn't garner as much attention as they should have, and the struggles Palestinian journalists face. Our first speaker of today's panel discussion is Mariam Barghouti. Mariam is a Palestinian writer and researcher based in Ramallah. She earned a BA in English Language and Literature from Birzeit University, an MSc in Sociology and Global Change from the University of Edinburgh. She worked as a journalist and reporter with a focus on the Levant and published various socio-political commentaries from Palestine. Her reporting and analysis have been featured in Al Jazeera English, The New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, the BBC, and Middle East Eye. She has also undertaken monitoring and evaluation missions of humanitarian and development aid in Jordan, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon for various governmental and non-governmental organizations. She is also a policy member with the Palestinian think tank Al-Shabaka and provides consulting on context analysis and risk mitigation, advocacy, creative direction, and she is also a lecturer of sociology. Over to you, Mariam.
Thank you for that, Farah. And I appreciate you for that introduction. I witness and I write more than anything. And thank you for having me here and holding this panel, especially in light of the ongoing attack and assault on Palestinian journalists in Palestine. And that includes Gaza, namely in regards to the way Palestinian journalists are being killed, as well as their families being targeted and killed in a punitive measure by the Israeli regime. We have up to 135 Palestinian journalists killed, and this is not including their family. And in the West Bank, we are facing an increased and intensified campaign by the Israeli regime to target Palestinian journalists, where we have 56 Palestinian journalists being held captive by the Israeli military in prisons, where at least 16 Palestinians were killed in these prisons since October 7th. And you can see that as a way of Israel to try and erase the Palestinian testimony, especially that this comes especially in the denial and refusal of international media organizations and international journalists, for the most part, to report on Palestine or to report accurately on Palestine. And that means not adopting the Israeli military's narrative of defense. So what we are seeing today is an accumulation of what's been really happening in the last decades across Palestine in geopolitical scope. But it is the complicity of media and the role of information in either perpetuating or obstructing the ongoing ethnic cleansing and genocide happening on Palestinians. As we have seen, the more and more students, especially in the US, but the more and more students had access to information, the more and more they knew where their tax dollars are being sent in terms of foreign military aid, the more and more they engaged in the process of decision making. We're seeing students being so brave in their refusal to be complicit in what is happening here. And that comes by arming themselves and equipping themselves with information first. So Israel's targeting of media, of journalists, of documentation from Palestine is not accidental. It is not without purpose. It is strategic, and it serves precisely that, to muddle what is happening here, to become this complicated debate of, do you believe in the right of Israel to exist, to doesn't Israel have the right to defend itself? No and no. No, an apartheid state should not exist. Genocide should not be okay and perpetuated. And yet Israel has muddled its practices behind these debates, in which international media was complicit in which international media perpetuated. I mean, the way you see journalists and hosts and correspondents speak with Palestinians, you realize that it's more akin to an interrogation rather than an interview. It is trying to trap rather than expose. So it shows you the journalistic malpractice that we have been experiencing worldwide when it comes to the case of Palestine, especially since October 7th, even though this precedes October 7th. And what that has at least showed me is that in light of failure of media organizations who are tasked, who have an oath towards their audience to share information, even when it defies authority, especially when it defies authority, when they refuse to do that, you see things like the New York Times had a memo directive given out to their journalists saying you can't use the words genocide or ethnic cleansing or even occupied territory. They weren't even allowed to acknowledge that Palestinians are under a military occupation. Again, this is documented, this is proven, this has been verified, corroborated across the spectrum of international organizations, from human rights to lawyers to journalists, independently or otherwise. But still, the New York Times told their reporters, we can't use these words. Why can't you use these words? Because they will elicit the emotion required, and that is anger, and that is frustration, and that is refusal to be complicit in these crimes. Because genocide is horrifying. Ethnic cleansing is horrifying. Being complicit in them makes you a criminal. And so, as we have seen, the more and more people gained access to information, the more and more they are better equipped to confront and challenge the policies being put in their name. But on the other hand, who is pushing forward the Palestinian stories? And that is Palestinian journalists. That is also civilian documentation units where you have Palestinians trying to record on their phones when journalists aren't allowed, such as the siege on Jenin refugee camp in December. The Israeli military actively denied us access into the camp. And so we had to rely a lot on civilian documentation to redraw what happened based on the testimonies, based on the statements. But what we are saying is that when communities are equipped with the information in real time, that they mobilize and they act as agents within their community. They're not just passive observers. And this is why Israel, as well as its allies across the world, have ensured to try and perpetuate a certain narrative. It's strategically built. It is a narrative that is strategically built since before October 7th. If you go into the statements made by Israeli policymakers and prime ministers in the 50s and the 60s, one of the main things they kept emphasizing to soldiers and to the ministries is whatever happens, whatever the soldiers commit in crime, the number one thing is that the reputation of Israel in the international community remains untouched, and that it remains seen as this democracy that has legitimacy to basically erase an entire population and build a state on top of them. And that's why information is very important. And that's why testimonies are very important. And that's why it's very important to continue amplifying Palestinian voices, those that are testifying in their narrative, but also the analysts who are well versed in this context, because they have been either living it or collecting testimonies for years when no one else would. And on that note, I would kind of leave it off to my colleagues on this call to add to that. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Mariam. It's always an honor to hear from you. And for everyone who is tuning in online, I think it's really important now more than ever to amplify the voices of Palestinian journalists. So please do follow Mariam on social media. Her handle is @Mariam Barghouthi. So our next speaker for this evening's panel discussion, our next speaker is Malak Silmi. Malak is a Palestinian American freelance journalist based in Michigan. She holds bachelor's degrees in journalism and international studies from Wayne State University. She has previously written for Al Jazeera English, the Institute for Palestine Studies, and has covered politics for Outlier Media in Michigan and San Antonio Express News in Texas. Over to you, Malak.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for hosting this. A lot to what Mariam said, like the importance of having Palestinian journalists, that they're the ones that are sharing these stories in Palestine themselves and here abroad. And something that I've seen is I graduated college just a few years ago and have entered the journalism industry for about like 3 to 4 years, and just recently made the decision to actually leave. And that was a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons was this like mistrust in US media that I was seeing Muslim communities, Arab communities, and Palestinian communities face. And growing up here in the US, we saw a lot of the dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims in media since the war in Iraq and since the war on terror, and just a lack of accurate coverage of our communities. And so there was this mistrust. And the decision that I made to join this industry was really because of my Palestinian identity, because of the coverage that I've seen growing up, and wanting to make some kind of change with that, having more accurate coverage, bringing the Palestinian stories to light, bringing Muslim stories, Arab stories in America specifically, but even when it comes to international coverage. But unfortunately, what we've been seeing in the last 7 months, but even prior to that, is this constant inaccurate storytelling, as well as misinformation, as well as dehumanization of Palestinian journalists. And that has only caused people to increase their mistrust in the US media, in the, like, you know, like in the normal like outlets, the constant like the broadcast news channels, the mainstream news outlets that people usually rely on. But now what we're seeing, like Mariam said, is students and like just the general public equipping themselves with their own information through social media, through Instagram accounts of people on the ground, through even like expanding to international outlets, going beyond CNN, beyond New York Times, and not really only relying on those outlets to get their information. And that's when they're seeing the full scope of coverage and more accurate storytelling, and even seeing some of the lacking coverage of media, and like how like really how important it is for US media to be focused on holding US officials accountable. And not seeing that is what is forcing a lot of these students in the American public to look for other sources. And like personally, from my end, like I was working mostly in local journalism, but looking ahead, looking at my future in this industry, it really like it dawned on me that it's really hard to do any kind of coverage changes from the inside, because of the fact that this industry wasn't really built to elevate these people of color in these communities, and the communities that I belong to. So for me, like I ended up leaving my job, and I'm really focusing more on freelance pieces, like Farah had mentioned. But I, throughout my experiences, I have tried, specifically in like San Antonio when I was living there, I had tried publishing some articles on like local protests that were happening back in 2022 and 2021, like when Sheikh Jarrah protests and events were happening in Palestine. And my newsroom pushed back on that and did not allow for that kind of coverage. But then fast forward a few months later, when the Ukraine war had began, we were doing an all hands on deck approach where all reporters, no matter what your beat was, would cover, you know, anything that had to do with Ukraine or Russia, when it comes to like local bars that were boycotting vodka, or fundraisers for the Ukrainian resistance army. So we were doing a lot of that kind of coverage. And I had this meeting with my editor at the time, talking about, you know, like the flip side of how like covering a single protest was seen as like such a big thing. And like there was a lot of pushback, and there was a lot of silencing, and there's a lot of like context that was missing from the original reporting. And really just seeing the comparison of coverage that had to do with Palestine versus any other, you know, war coverage, or any like Ukraine specifically, it was very obvious how US media shies away from accurate reporting, but not only accurate reporting, but just like telling the story in general, and like even allowing it to reach the desks and the front pages. We've seen a lot more coverage now, but still it's been taking such a long time to even get some of the investigations that we've known since like October and November. Like for example, I think I just saw today NBC News mentioned an investigation that says they're just now confirming that Israel has been striking some of the cities in Gaza that they said were safe. And this is something we've known since the beginning of this genocide, where we heard this from citizen journalists and from journalists on the ground. But unfortunately, what we were seeing here in the US is that our outlets don't value Palestinian journalists on the ground, and instead they dehumanize them. And that's what is really causing this disconnect and this lacking representative coverage of Palestine. But thank you, and I appreciate you inviting me, and I hope my colleagues can also expand on this topic.
Thank you so much, Malak, for your time and your insight there. And again, Malak is a freelance journalist, and we need to be amplifying the voices of Palestinian journalists. So please do go find her work. Her name is Malak Silmi online, and follow her social media as well. Our next speaker of this panel discussion is Dawood Katab. Dawood is a Palestinian journalist and media activist. He is the former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. Dawood is currently the Director General of Community Media Network, CMN, is a not-for-profit media organization dedicated to advancing independent media in the Arab region. CMN is registered in Jordan, Palestine, and administers Radio Al-Balad in Amman, and Katab was elected as a deputy chair of the Vienna-based International Press Institute. He's a regular columnist in the Washington, D.C.-based Al Monitor and Middle East reporter with Arab News. He is a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, the Middle East Institute, Project Syndicate, and other publications. He's the author of Sesame Street, Palestine by Bear Manor Publishing. Over to you, Dawood. So we're just waiting for Dawood to join us. So we will go to Nader now. If that is okay, we'll just go to Nader whilst we're fixing a technical issue. So we'll start with Nader. Hi, Nader. I'll just give you an introduction.
Sounds good.
So Nader is a journalist and the founder of Palestine in America. Over to you, Nader.
Hello, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be on this call with other great journalists. My story is a little bit different, and every time I think back on my story and how I got into journalism, it feels a little bit sillier, but it's my story. When I first fell in love with journalism, I was, in high school, just realizing I was never going to be an athlete, a professional athlete at that. And I decided, what's the next best thing? And I decided, covering those games that I love to participate in. So my dream was to be a reporter for any of the I'm located in Chicago, and some of my favorite teams are the Cubs, the Bulls, and the Chicago Bears. And I wanted to be a beat reporter. And when I went to school for journalism, Columbia College in downtown Chicago, one of the main things they harped on was being fair, being balanced, and don't be biased. And whenever I thought about Palestine, whenever I thought about Palestine, there was no way I could be not biased. I was obviously fair, but I felt, my emotions were too high on the issue. And the way that, journalism was taught to me, I didn't feel qualified to report on these issues. So, I got my own, I worked for the paper at the college, worked for the radio station, was on that route to become like a sports reporter. When I decided to write a column about these two Palestinian boys that were walking home from soccer practice, and they were attacked by Israeli soldiers and Israeli dogs, and the doctor said they would never play soccer again. So I wrote a column about how FIFA should punish Israel, kick them out of the FIFA, suspend them, do something. They were having an upcoming meeting in a few months. It was timely, but I was told by a mentor that my column was going to be held off. So I experienced what so many other people who tried to report on Palestine in the past, where you get censored for writing about Palestine. And so that experience is what motivated me to. It's funny because they try to get us away from writing about Palestine. They try to get us away from advocating for Palestine, but all their actions end up pushing us more into, activism or journalism, whatever it is that has to do with Palestine. So I decided I didn't want any other Palestinian journalists to have a similar, experience, especially starting out in, journalism. I wanted them, give them a publication that would make it easier for them to get their bylines without, their work being silenced because it's about Palestine. So I created the magazine, which is a quarterly print issue now. It started off as an annual print issue, but now it's a quarterly print issue. We publish, music editions, politics editions, but yeah. So pretty much when I was writing that column for my college paper, a lot of the things that my colleagues discussed was happening to me, where somebody I looked up to in the journalism industry, his name was Jeffrey Lyon, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, is telling me, I can't use words like occupied territories, and I can't, say it's an illegal occupation. And when I would tell him this is under UN international law, he would say, not everybody agrees with international law. And that's when it really clicked with me that if me as a Palestinian journalist didn't use my voice for our issues and I wasn't telling our stories, we would have a bunch of Jeffrey Lyons telling our stories. And although, back then things were not good when, it came to mainstream media, it has gotten so much better in the last 10 years since I started Palestine in America. But we still see repression. We still see mainstream news outlets, fail to give context. They always are trying to make you see the student activists across the country doing encampments, and they're focusing on the encampments and not what the encampments are about. So there's still ways to go, but I'm hoping that, my magazine can help with, what our industry has been for most of its history, terrible towards Palestinians and not telling our stories accurately. So yeah, so I started my magazine to help do that. And right now we have freelancers around the country that report and write for us. And hopefully we get to do bigger and better things. And hopefully in the future, we don't really have to be, worrying about these things and they come naturally. Like I'm part of a group called Amnesia, and they're always working hard within the mainstream news, people that work in those like NPR, New York Times, they're always trying to work from the inside, even though it's been a slow process. I will say, like, I feel like we're at a horizon, but I'd like to hear more about from either if there's any more colleagues that are here to speak on it. But I really appreciate you guys giving me the time to tell you guys about my story and what I've been working on.
Thank you so much, Nada, for your time. And thank you for your insight as well. And again, we need to amplify voices just like Nada's and not the Jeffreys. So please do follow Nada on his social media, Nada Hamoud, and also Palestine in America. Thank you again, Nada. We're just going to take a 10-minute break before finishing and rounding off with our final speaker. So please join us in 10 to 15 minutes time. Thank you. So we're just resuming the event again. So the final speaker of today's panel discussion is Daoud Khattab. Daoud is a Palestinian journalist and media activist. He is the former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. He is also currently the Director General of Community Media Network, CMN, a not-for-profit media organization dedicated to advancing independent media in the Arab region. CMN is registered in Jordan and Palestine and administers Radio Al Balad in Amman. Khattab was also elected as the deputy chair of the Vienna-based International Press Institute. He's a regular columnist with the Washington, D.C.-based Al Monitor and a Middle East reporter with Arab News. He's a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, the Middle East Institute, Project Syndicate, and other publications. He's the author of Sesame Street Palestine by Bear Manor Publishing. Over to you, Daoud.
Thank you very much for the invite, and sorry about the time difference. Anyway, I'm very pleased that you're paying attention to the issue of journalism and journalists, because I think one of the biggest victims of this conflict has been the truth, and one of the biggest victimizers has been the traditional media that has played politics in its coverage of the conflict, and basically downplayed or even ignored a lot of the facts that are going on. And the biggest problem has been that the international media has been absent from Gaza due to pressure from Israel that has banned any journalist from entering into Gaza and reporting from Gaza. So that has left Palestinian journalists to use whatever available social media, and some of them writing for some of the Arab media and international media to have covered the conflict. The problem has been that the Israelis have tried to paint Palestinian journalists as biased, and at the same time kept international journalists out, and therefore it was able to bias and to color the facts on the ground to always represent the narrative that Israel has always wanted to show. You know, I always said that if there was a well-known international journalist at Shifa Hospital, Israel could not have lied to the world that under Shifa Hospital was Hamas headquarters. But because there was no journalists from the West that could not be easily painted as being biased, they were able to do whatever they wanted in the painting of the press coverage as being biased. And still, Israel, as we know, has killed more than 130, I think, journalists. Destroyed 60 major international and local and Arab media outlets, and it has put all kinds of political pressure on people writing and reporting, in which everyone has to basically condemn Hamas before being allowed to write anything, because that was kind of the passport in order to write anywhere. In fact, I had that kind of problem when I tried to write for one of the international media outlets. The editor changed my op-ed to say, after Hamas barbaric attack. I said to the editor, I never used the word barbaric. And basically his answer was, if you don't use these terms, then you cannot get published. So we've had a very big mountain to climb to bring credibility, and thank God, because of social media, that people were able to get information out, and we saw that the best picture in the world was a picture taken by a Palestinian journalist of parents clutching to their dead child, and that actually has been a powerful image that has basically moved hearts and minds around the world. There is a few facts that most people don't know. That Israel, in all 57 years of occupation, has never recognized a single Palestinian journalist working for Palestinian media. they don't exist as far as Israel is concerned. There are Palestinian journalists working for international media that are recognized and given press cards, but a Palestinian journalist working for Palestinian media does not exist. There is no category, and not a single Palestinian journalist has ever been recognized, given press credentials, or dealt with as a journalist. And as we've been noticing, that for Israel, a Palestinian journalist is like any other Palestinian. They're all kind of treated as terrorists or would-be terrorists or potential terrorists or so on. The second thing is that travel is not allowed to Palestinians. Palestinians from the West Bank are not allowed to get to Gaza. Palestinians from Gaza are not allowed to get to the West Bank, and neither Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza are allowed to enter Israel. And so that has contributed in, again, denying Palestinians the simple and basic right that any journalist needs, which is to have access to areas of conflict and to be able to cover it and so on. Thank God we've basically had to depend on local journalists. Many of them had to be trained quickly, and some of them were not up to the position that they were forced to deal with. And again, then, they're attacked for not being enough professional enough. But it's the Israelis who have denied Palestinian journalism. And of course, we all know that the well-respected, well-known American Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in Jenin, and until this moment, the killer has not been taken and held accountable for killing her. Even though, if an American journalist anywhere in the world was killed, we would see a different result. And even the FBI and CIA, which also apparently did their own research, have not released their information about how and who killed Shireen Abu Akleh. Israel tried initially to claim that there was crossfire and she might have been killed by a Palestinian, but all that has been debunked by some really well-done international journalists, investigative journalists, I think including the Washington Post, I believe, which basically debunked all these things. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about social media and shadow downing. I don't know what the term is, but it's when the big tech giant companies like Facebook and Twitter and so on reduce the availability of content that has a particular point of view. It's not clear exactly what has happened. A number of international organizations have accused these giant companies of manipulating and trying to downgrade the distribution of social media content coming from Palestinians. And a kind of a funny story has happened, because a lot of young Palestinian bloggers have realized that their content is not being seen by many people because of who they are or where they're coming from. And so they started doing a few tricks, if I can use the word. So on Instagram, they would take a picture of a scene of nature, a nature scene. Now, Instagram gatekeepers would basically, okay, let that particular post go on, and lo and behold, the users, once they get to see an item from a person that they're following, can easily walk back and see all the other things that they have posted, which was never made available. And even more crazy trick was used by one or a couple of people who inserted a tiny Israeli emoji in their content, but they also made sure that this emoji stays on for very, very few seconds and then it disappears. And so the Israeli emoji flag basically fooled the gatekeepers by seeing an Israeli flag, and so they allowed that particular post. And most people who saw it realized what it was, and most of them didn't even see the Israeli flag. So these are some of the tricks that some bloggers had to use to circumvent the attempts by social media to downplay and basically weaken the distribution of their content. Nevertheless, I read somewhere that compared to about 800 million pro-Israeli posts on social media, there was 12 billion with a B, 12 billion pro-Palestinian posts in the last 6 months or so on. So there has been a huge appetite and huge willingness to watch and listen and see the posts coming from Gaza, coming from the West Bank, that are authentic and representing the reality on the ground. Now, obviously, CNN and NBC, CNN, NBC, CBS, BBC didn't produce a lot of these things, although they've tried every now and then to present some images of Palestine. But for the most part, the anchors and the star reporters have not been allowed at all to enter Gaza. I think one CNN reporter sneaked in for like one day with the Emirati medical supplies, and then went back and reported from Abu Dhabi whatever she saw. But in general, until this moment, not a single international journalist has been allowed into Gaza, even from the Egyptian side. And I've asked a few people, well, the Egyptians, why do they not allow the journalists in? And the foreign minister told a friend of mine who works for CNN that Israelis blackmailed the Egyptians and told them, if a single international journalist enters, we will stop all humanitarian aid to Palestinians. And so as a result, we've not been able to encourage and to support, to get the Egyptians to allow journalists willing to enter into the war zone because of this threat that the Israelis have made. And obviously, if they had entered Israel, clearly would not have provided them with the immunity and safety that they are supposed to get. And so as a result, as I've said from the beginning, until this moment, not a single international journalist has been allowed to cover Gaza from inside the Gaza Strip. These are some of the issues that surround the work of journalism and coverage of Palestine. I'm happy to be around if you have questions, or if you want to engage with the discussion. Farah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your time, Dawood. We're actually wrapping up the event now, but I want to say a massive thank you for your time and your invaluable contribution. Thank you again, Dawood.
You're welcome.
Just wrapping up today's panel discussion, a huge thank you to all of our speakers, to Mariam, to Malek, to Nada, and to Dawood. Please keep your eye on PRC's social media, as we have another event coming up this Wednesday entitled British and Irish Trade Unions on Palestine, delving into the historic solidarity between trade unions and the Palestinian struggle, their trade unions' personal connection to the Palestinian struggle, as well as trade union and worker mobilization as a means of popular struggle for Palestine's freedom and liberation. Thank you very much for your time, and hope you join us on Wednesday.